third volume of the TFAHR Bylazora publication, we thought it would be useful to provide some general history and a timeline concerning the Corinthian architectural order. In the excavations of the palace in Sector 6, we found sculpted stones, which when looked at as a group seemed to us to fit perfectly into the classical Corinthian scheme. But we were faced with an opposing viewpoint among some of our colleagues who were arguing that the stones represented to them unique examples of a native Paionian order, an order previously unattested at any archaeological site.
In our article in Volume 3, we proved that the sculpted stones were the remains of a structure constructed using the fully evolved Corinthian order. But we had one more reason for tracing the evolution of the Corinthian order. Unlike the Doric and the Ionic, and unlike the Aeolian, whose origins are obscured by the mists of history, the Corinthian order evolved completely within the historical era. In other words, we have written sources and fairly good archaeological records to trace the dates of various developments of the Corinthian order. It's a commonplace of classical architectural studies that the Corinthian order is a composite of the Ionic base and the Ionic column, the Corinthian capital, the lower entablature of the Ionic, and the Persian dentil for the upper entablature. And fortunately, we know when all these parts came together, and this well-documented evolution provides support for us to date the Bylazora Palace to the time of Philip V. So, let's look at the evidence for the Corinthian at Bylazora.
As we pointed out in Volume 3, the reason for calling these capitals Corinthian was questionable even in ancient times. The Callimachus story is hardly believable, but this much is certain. The use of the Corinthian was at first pretty much confined to the Peloponnese, and it was at first exclusively used in the interior of the building. We don't know why this was the case, but slowly things began to change. We have in the appendix of Volume 3 a chart showing how the various elements of the Corinthian order came together. To summarize this timeline, the first appearance of the Corinthian capital is at the Temple of Apollo at Basi in the late 5th century BC, in the interior of the temple. The first known use of the dentils was in the tomb of the Persian Shah Darius I in the early 5th century BC. The use of the dentil passed through Lycia, as we can see in some of the Lycian tombs. And then dentils make an appearance in the Erechtheion at Athens in conjunction with the Ionic order in the late 5th century BC.
The first time that dentils are used in conjunction with the Corinthian capital is in the Choragic monument of Lysicrates in 334 BC in Athens. This was also the first time that we know of that the Corinthian capital appeared on the exterior of a building. It must have been quite a shocking innovation for its time, because after that the Corinthian capital retreated back into the interior of the building. It would not be until the mid-3rd century BC that the Corinthian appeared again on the outside of a building, on the propylon of Ptolemy II at Samothrace, and then the Belevi monument near Ephesus.
Now that we've looked at the evolution of the Corinthian order across the Aegean world, let's focus on what we have of the Corinthian order at Bylazora. Our first discovery came in the final days of the 2012 excavation season, when we found two capitals pressed up against the palace wall. Because the area we were allowed to excavate that year was so narrow, we could only expose one side of each capital, and they looked to us like nothing we had ever seen before. But in the 2013 season, after we expanded the trenches, we were finally able to see all four sides of both capitals. It was then that we realized what we were looking at. These were two unfinished Corinthian capitals. They had been abandoned in the process of being carved. Each one of the 8 sides was in a different stage of completion. And so, by examining each side in sequence, we can get a clear idea about how our sculptors worked on the capitals, moving from one stage to the next. These pieces gave us an excellent insight into the working process of ancient sculptors.
These two unfinished capitals never stood atop columns, but in the course of digging out the area on top of and in front of the monumental stairway, we found more carved stones which had fallen from the columns and the entablature of the facade, containing all the elements of the classical Corinthian order. Let's look at these pieces of this facade from the bottom up. One of the two plinths for the columns remains in place. The top photograph shows the extant plinth. The bottom photograph is where the missing plinth would have stood. We know there was another plinth from the rough scar of its original position on the top step of the monumental stairway. The dimensions of the plinth follow the classical Corinthian ratio. Of the round column bases, we found only fragments, but it was easy to extrapolate the circumference of the base from these fragments, and it matched almost to the exact centimeter the width of the plinth. Both columns were discovered fallen across the stairs. They are in a very bad state of preservation.
Each column would have been topped by a Corinthian capital. We found numerous fragments of these capitals, and it was easy to determine which part of the capital they belonged to. These fragments show signs of having been covered with whitewash, which would have been applied only after the carving on the capital was complete. Remember that the first two capitals we found were not finished, but maybe the sculptors working on them were using as models the complete capitals still on top of the columns standing on the facade of the palace. Stones of all bands of the entablature were found. The architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. Notice the dentils on the cornice are plastered and painted. Again, this is something which would have been done only after the stone was put into position.
Looking at all the pieces together, it's obvious that we have examples of all the elements of a full Corinthian facade in its completed form, fronting the palace of Philip V. In our video, The Last Palace of the Last Macedonian Kings, we go through the process of reconstructing the facade from the plinth up, and we have calculated the height of the facade. Well, what can we say about the date of this Corinthian facade? Because we have a fully evolved Corinthian colonnade with a dentiled entablature on the outside of the palace, we would place the construction of this facade no earlier than the middle of the 3rd century BC. We propose that the architecture of the palace facade, like the architecture of the Stoa, points to King Philip V as builder.
To answer critics who want to date this palace much earlier and who want to cast the facade architecture as the achievement of native Paionian architects, we ask again, as we did in the discussion of the fluted faceted column that we discussed in Chapter 5, is it more likely that an architectural innovation, like the exterior use of the Corinthian in combination with the dentil, is it more likely that this happened first in the cosmopolitan world of the Aegean or in far-off Bylazora in Paionia? We suspect that it happened in the Aegean, and that Philip V's architects, whoever they might have been, brought this innovation from the larger Hellenic world to Bylazora, where it was then used on the vestibule to the entrance to Philip V's palace.
We'd like to finish this program by looking at a few other pieces of sculpture of the Corinthian order found at Bylazora. We've seen one of them already in a discussion of the remnants of the Stoa in Chapter 5. Near the Doric order stones that were piled up to be burnt down into lime mortar, we found a very roughly cut block of about the same size as our two unfinished capitals. Although it was very badly damaged from exposure to tremendous heat, this piece looks to us as if it too was meant to be carved into a Corinthian capital, but never finished.
In front of the People's Museum of Sveti Nikolae, we see this Corinthian capital. It's quite different in style from the unfinished capitals at Bylazora and the fragments of the finished capitals. We learned from the men of Kneža that it was first found in the trench dug by the Yugoslavian Army in 1983. This army trench would become our Sector 6, the site of the palace. The men said that this capital was found just outside our palace. Well, that was interesting, but given how much the army rearranged the terrain, that capital could have been dragged from anywhere on the hill. But as we were collecting the stone fragments of the facade from the stairs, we came across this small sherd. It's obviously an acanthus leaf fragment, but not of the style of the facade capitals or the unfinished capitals. It does, though, match the style of the museum capital, so maybe after all the museum capital does come from the palace.
In 1986, Gorica Mikkelcic reported on a sculpted block found in Kneža. That stone has long since gone missing, but a photo was made of it and we made a drawing from that photograph. Vladimir Atanasov noted that the strange barbed design on the Mikkelcic stone very closely resembles the barbed caliculi of our palace capitals, and these barbed caliculi are most unusual in Corinthian architecture. As a matter of fact, we have as yet found no parallels to them in the Hellenic world. Could it be that the Mikkelcic stone came from the palace? Might there be a frieze waiting to be discovered within the ruins of the palace?
Gorica Mikkelcic dated the stone to the 5th century BC, but our research has shown that the rosette didn't make its appearance in Hellenic architecture until the very late 4th century BC, and the interned anthemion did not appear until even later. Again, these dates refer to the very first appearances of these design elements in the more cosmopolitan cities of the Aegean. They probably came to Bylazora considerably later, maybe with the arrival of the architects of Philip V.
We were quite amazed as we slowly uncovered the parts of the Corinthian facade, and we were thoroughly stunned that the Corinthian order should appear so early in so remote a place as Bylazora on the Paionian frontier. But there is no doubt in our minds that what we have is traditional Corinthian, and not some hitherto unattested native Paionian school of architecture. Given that all the elements of the Corinthian had come together in the Aegean world by the mid-3rd century BC, we believe that its appearance in Bylazora has to be the work of Philip V and his architects.